There is a version of Earth that no human being has ever seen. A version so different from the one we know that if you were somehow dropped into it, you would not recognize the ground beneath your feet, the air filling your lungs, or the towering shapes rising all around you. The forests of that world were not forests the way we understand forests. The plants were not plants the way we understand plants. And yet, everything alive on Earth today, every tree, every flower, every blade of grass, owes some part of its existence to what grew and died in those ancient, forgotten landscapes. This is not a story about the plants we have. This is a story about the ones we lost, the strangest, most extraordinary flora that ever grew on this planet, and the world they built before they disappeared forever. To understand just how strange prehistoric plant life was, it helps to understand one fundamental truth about evolution. Life does not move in a straight line towards something better. It experiments, it branches, it fills every available space with wildly different solutions to the same basic problem of survival. And plants, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, arrived at solutions that modern life has never needed to rediscover. Solutions so strange and so specific to their time that when the conditions that created them vanished, so did they. We begin in the Devonian period, roughly 350 to 420 million years ago, a time that scientists sometimes call the Age of Fishes, but which could just as easily be called the Age of the First Forests. Before this period, land was largely bare. Fungi, some mosses, and early spore-bearing plants clung to coastal edges, but the interior of every continent was essentially empty. Then something remarkable happened. Plants began to grow tall. One of the earliest and strangest of these pioneers was a plant called proto-lepidodendron, a distant relative of nothing you have ever seen. It was small by later standards, but it represented something entirely new on Earth, a plant that grew upward, that reached toward light in a coordinated and structured way, that invested in tissue to support its own height. It had no flowers, no seeds, no fruit. It reproduced through spores, the way ferns still do today, and its body was more like a living experiment than a finished design. But the Devonian also produced something far more dramatic. Archaeopteryx was a tree, or at least what we today would call a tree, and by the late Devonian it covered vast stretches of the northern hemisphere in what may have been the world's first true forests. Archaeopteryx was extraordinary for its time because it combined two strategies that had never been combined before. It had a woody trunk, the kind of dense lignin-reinforced structure that allowed it to grow tall and strong, and it had broad, fern-like leaves arranged in spreading branches, a design that captured sunlight with remarkable efficiency. It is considered by many paleobotanists to be one of the most ecologically significant plants that ever lived, not because it was the most complex, but because it changed the planet. Its roots broke into soil and rock, releasing minerals into rivers and oceans. Its forests altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. Scientists believe the explosive growth of forests like those dominated by Archaeopteryx may have contributed to a dramatic drop in carbon dioxide levels during the late Devonian, cooling the planet and potentially contributing to a mass extinction event. A tree, in other words. The Permian period, which followed the Carboniferous, brought a different set of plant forms to dominance, many of them grouped under the informal term glossopterids. These were seed plants, and that distinction matters enormously. The shift from spore reproduction to seed reproduction was one of the most consequential transitions in the history of plant life. Seeds encapsulate a living embryo with its own food supply, protected within a tough outer coat. They can survive drought, cold, and long periods of dormancy. They can be carried by wind or animals across vast distances. Seed plants, in short, are extraordinarily resilient compared to their spore-bearing predecessors. Glossopteris was the dominant seed plant of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent that included what is now South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. It had distinctive tongue-shaped leaves with a prominent central vein, and its fossils have been found on every one of those now separated landmasses, which was in fact one of the early pieces of evidence that helped scientists reconstruct the existence of Gondwana in the first place. Robert Falcon Scott's doomed Antarctic expedition in 1912 famously recovered Glossopteris fossils from the ice, just kilometers from the South Pole, evidence that Antarctica was once a temperate forested land. Glossopteris forests stretched across Gondwana for tens of millions of years, producing a distinctive ecology of large, shade-tolerant trees that fed ecosystems we can only partially reconstruct from fossil evidence. And then the Permian ended. The mass extinction at the boundary of the Permian and Triassic periods, roughly 252 million years ago, was the most severe extinction event in the history of complex life. Scientists estimate that somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species and roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species were wiped out. Plants suffered enormously as well. The Glossopteris forests of Gondwana essentially vanished. There is evidence in the fossil record of what paleontologists call a fungal spike, a sudden and dramatic abundance of fungal spores in rock layers from this period, suggesting that after the mass extinction, the landscape was briefly dominated by fungi, feeding on vast quantities of dead plant material. The world went quiet and dark, and it took millions of years for complex forests to return. The Triassic and Jurassic periods brought new plant forms, and among the strangest was the group known as the Bennetales, or cycadioids. These plants looked superficially like cycads, those ancient-looking palm-like plants that still grow in tropical regions today, but they were not cycads, not even close relatives by most analyses. Bennetales had thick, barrel-like trunks covered in a rough armor of old leaf bases, and they produced structures that resembled flowers, which is deeply unusual for plants of this age. Scientists debate whether these flower-like reproductive organs represent a genuine evolutionary experiment with insect pollination, or whether the resemblance to flowers is more superficial than functional. What is clear is that Bennetales were a remarkably successful group for a very long time, surviving through the Triassic and Jurassic and into the Cretaceous before disappearing entirely. No living plant descended from them. They are a completely extinct lineage, a branch on the tree of life that grew for over 100 million years and then was simply cut off. Among the most haunting of all prehistoric plants are the seed ferns, or teratosperms, a group that is not actually related to either modern ferns or modern seed plants in any direct way, but which combined features of both in ways that confused botanists for generations after their fossils were first discovered. Seed ferns had